Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another fascinating episode of the Authors on Mission podcast. Today, start off by just closing your eyes and imagine that you're 4 years old, clutching your favorite doll, standing on a tarmac in California as your mother leads you towards a plane that will carry you to Pakistan, a country you can't even pronounce. By the time you're 13, you've lived through 2 wars, attended 20 schools across 4 countries, and learned that home isn't just a place on a map, it's something more elusive. This is the real story of our guest today, Inga Aksamit, author of the remarkable Between Worlds, an expert's quest for belonging. Inga is what's known as a third culture kid, someone who grew up between cultures, never truly belonging to one single place, but carrying pieces of everywhere she's been. So we're going to have a fascinating conversation about her book, her experiences, and some writing tips today. Buckle up. It's going to be a fun journey between worlds. And welcome to our show. I'm so honored to have you on.
Thanks so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Hey, real quick before we jump back in, if you're loving what we're doing here, hit that subscribe button and drop us a like. We're bringing you the best authors, the most real conversations, and all the writing wisdom that you didn't know you needed. So stick around because it only gets better from here. All right, now let's get back to the conversation.
Of course. So I was looking through all your materials, reading over your book a little bit, and you really have been in so many different locations. It's something that a lot of people envy. So I just have to say kudos to you, and it's great that you wrote a book about it, and here you are spreading your knowledge to everybody else. It's incredible.
Thank you.
Of course. So I'm wondering if you don't mind walking us through a little bit of what ultimately led you to writing your book. I'm curious to know if there was a specific point that you decided, you know what, I have to start putting this into words, or was it a slow growth of inspiration? What exactly led you on that path?
I thought of it a few years ago, and what I really wanted was for my mother to write the book, because I was so young during some of the experiences that I thought that it would be a natural book for her to write. And she was a travel writer as well. I kind of followed in her footsteps towards the end of my working career. And what really prompted me to write the book was after both of my parents passed away. They both passed away around the time of the COVID pandemic, not related to COVID. But when my father passed away and they were both gone, I realized there was no one left to remember with me all the things that I had been through in my childhood, all the places we lived. And I also realized that way of life was changing in so many of the countries we lived in. As many countries are developing, it was very different. So then I thought, I think there was a good reason for recording what happened to us. And also, I realized there's a lot of kids who grew up like me, and it's helpful to see yourself in other people's words.
Wow, definitely. I'm really glad that you were able to, eventually get it into words. And I am sorry to hear about your parents, but
Thank you.
It is a great way to leave a legacy. There's no better way than putting it into a book with your name on it that everybody else can learn from. So it's great that you were able to eventually. By the way, speaking of which, you do have it displayed right there behind you on the shelf, which I think is very cool. I'm curious to know, did you design the cover yourself? Was that kind of part of the publishing process?
It was part of the publishing process. So my publisher, the Publishing Circle, had a designer. And so they asked me for some of my ideas, and I had gone through several covers that I liked. And this was one of the concepts that I gave them, the idea of having 2 images to contrast the different places I lived. And so the Golden Gate Bridge represents, of course, California, which is where we generally landed between jobs because my father's company was based in San Francisco. And then many of the places we lived in Southeast Asia. So I wanted some architecture that looked very different from what we would usually find in the United States.
I like how you put a lot of intention into it, though. That's what's important. I always like to touch upon covers when we're on this podcast because,
Mm-hmm.
everyone likes to say we don't judge a book by its cover, but at the end of the day, it does play a big role, and it also gives a good sneak peek into what the story is about. So it's good that you
Mm-hmm.
did put all that thought into it, and it is beautifully designed too. It's very
Thank you.
eye-catching as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. But let's open up that cover a little bit and talk a little bit about the content, right? So I noticed, a big theme of this, of course, the title is Between Worlds, and that pretty much leads us to knowing that you were living between rather than in a culture. So I'm wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about that. Was there a certain moment when you realized this fact? Was it
Mm-hmm.
a challenge as you came to terms and learned exactly what was going on? I'm curious to know.
I think the first time I realized that I was truly different was in high school. And so before that, there were times that I was in the United States, but when I was overseas, I felt more normal because most of the kids that I associated with in international schools or American schools were living a similar lifestyle. So many of us were uprooted every 2 years. It might have been diplomat families, military, other corporate executives that were moving around the world. And so we didn't always ask, where are you from? We usually asked, where were you last? Where are you going next? How long is your father's contract for? Because in those days, it was mostly the fathers. And so in high school, when I was in Marin County in a suburban school where it seemed to me that most kids had been going to school together since they were into kindergarten. And so they all knew each other really well and they had lots of history. And it was also in an area, an affluent, predominantly white area. So they just did not really understand my lifestyle, and I didn't really understand their lifestyle. And of course, as a teenager, the most important thing you want to do is fit in. So mostly what I was trying to do was minimize the differences and not talk about them so much. So that's when I thought I kind of had that recognition of, if I want to fit in, I've got to figure out how people are interacting here. And so in all the places we lived, there were very different cultures. We lived in Pakistan and South America and Indonesia, and those were all very different from each other and required that we learn certain customs. And in any of the schools I was in, I had to learn, when you're little, the most important thing was to learn the playground games. And so often when I went to school, I would be confronted with games I never played before. So it became imperative to learn those before, dealing with homework and things like that.
Understood. Well, it is a very challenging thing to come to terms with, but it seems like you've really grown from it, and it's something that, now you're sharing with others, which is just incredible. But kind of going into the writing process about this then, what was it like to translate such personal themes and experiences into the writing process? I'm wondering if you had any certain strategies that perhaps the authors listening today who are also writing about these interesting times in their lives might be able to employ as well. Was there a specific method that you might have used to
I did choose to stay in the child point of view, and there's pros and cons to that. It allowed me to immerse myself back in the memories that I had, and some of them were very vivid, mostly because they were so different, and some of the experiences were a bit traumatic, being in wars, experiencing military evacuations. That's not something that most young children would be experiencing. So some of my memories might be more vividly experienced in my mind than kids who live in the same place all the time and things blur together. So I had the benefit of that, but I did choose to stay in the child point of view and tried to recount my emotional reactions as I would as a child. So when I was 4 or 8, I didn't have a lot of the vocabulary that we have as an adult to describe some of those. So I had to go back to just the visceral memories. And then I had to fill in with a little bit of research because I had my impressions of why wars were happening, for example. Why was India and Pakistan, why were they fighting each other?
Mm-hmm.
Why was there the civil war in East Pakistan that led to the birth of Bangladesh? So I had to fill in with some research, reading books looking at archives. And there's so much available, of course, online now that made it a lot easier, looking for photographs and other people's stories about similar times.
Understood. So I see you kind of took a different approach to it then by, first off, as you mentioned, putting it through the child's eyes. It kind of gave you a lens switch to approach it, which I think that's a great tactic. Rather than the adult perspective looking back, putting you in the moment. So I can see that also captures the readers as well. So that's great. It's a great way to get them involved and interested in it too. Well, all that being said, though, you did experience it, as a child. I mean, meaning the wars, all the current events happening at the time. I'm assuming that means you had to do a lot of research as you went into the writing of it. So what was that like? I'm sure it was pretty extensive to make sure everything was accurate according to your memory too.
Correct. And I was kind of amazed at how many things were accurate, but there were a few things where I thought, no, that couldn't have happened in that sequence. And I'd have to go back and sort things out. The first thing was that I started realizing that after so much time has passed, that I was starting to lose track of where I lived in which order. And by that time, my father was about 96 years old. He died at 98. And so I started asking him, and he was always our family historian, and he always had those facts just right in his mind. But even he was starting to lose track. So one of the first things I did was to take our pretty big stack of passports, which I still had most of them for all three of us, my mother and my father and me. And so I squinted and sorted and tried to read all of those stamps. Some of them were in other languages, some were in other scripts, like the Arabic script. They were in Farsi. And so it was very challenging, but I created a spreadsheet that helped me keep track of exactly which year, exact dates when we left countries, which helped me sort out when our evacuation date might have been, for example. So that was a really concrete thing that helped me a lot. And then some things I found really helpful were Time magazine. I either went to their archives or there's so much available on eBay. So I could find some profiles of, for example, my father's company that he did his first job in Afghanistan before he even met my mother. And so I got a really old copy of the Time magazine that profiled that. And there was actually a picture of them, draftsmen in the long traditional robes out in the desert with their drafting table and their instruments. And so it was a really interesting contrast. New York Times has a digital archives. And so I was able to find the actual articles written by a war reporter during the civil war in East Pakistan. And he was there at the same time I was and reporting on some of the same things that we could see from our roof. So that was incredibly helpful. And then there were other more obscure things. Like I started getting curious about what my father's job actually was as an irrigation engineer. Why were we there? What was he working on in those years? And, when I was 7 years old, I was not particularly interested in the work of an irrigation engineer, but suddenly I was very interested. And I had his CV, but that only had a very small, blurb about what the work he did. So I was really pleased to find that World Bank has digitized their project reports going way back to the 60s and even into the 50s. So I was able to find World Bank reports, and they did the funding for USAID projects, which were generally what my dad was working on. So overseas governments would get USAID projects, they would get World Bank funding, and then they would reach out to consultants around the world. And the jobs that my dad's company bid for and were accepted for, those were the ones that we worked on. So I was able to find a lot of information about what my dad was working on. And it was primarily irrigation systems. So not necessarily big dams, but irrigation systems to help countries improve their agricultural output so that they didn't have to import so much food for their own people, or that they would have food to export for revenue.
Understood. Well, wow, it's a huge process you did have to go through. You started off by saying you were It's good though, because you do need to make sure that everything that goes into your book is structurally sound, credible, fact check. You don't want to publish something that's just not correct, right? So it's great that you did go through all of that. Am I understanding correctly too? You also reached out to some old classmates on Facebook as well. Is that correct?
I did, yes. So that was that happened kind of late in the process. So I had the basic structure of the book. I had the outline of what happened to us in the places that we lived. And then I started getting, as I wondered about how I was going to end the book. I don't know how most authors are, but as I was writing it, I just wasn't quite sure till I got further into it about what time period I was going to end this. And so I wanted to cover my childhood, but then I realized that there was really more to the story. I could just do a travel log and explain where we were, but I got more curious myself about the impact of all the moves, some of the things we had seen, some of the things that happened to me. And I wondered if there was any information about how that lifestyle affects the development, the adult development of kids who grew up that way. So it led me down several paths, and one of them was trying to find other people who grew up like me. So I was just Googling one day. I was typing in these very long, awkward sentences, and this was before AI, so it was really kind of challenging Google to come up with something. And so I would write things like, how do I find other children who grew up overseas, whose fathers worked in different companies? And it kept coming up with this term called third culture kids. And I just kept ignoring that because it didn't sound like anything that applied to me. And finally, when I went back to it and read the definition, I thought, oh my goodness, that's exactly me. Once I had a term, a search term, it opened up this whole new world. So I can explain what a third culture kid is. The first culture refers to the passport culture. So for me, that's United States. The second culture refers to the host culture. So at any particular time, I had a second culture, but they didn't add up. I didn't have a third and fourth and fifth and sixth. It's just when we lived in Pakistan, that was our second culture. So that informs how I developed at that time. And then the third culture is the one that refers to all of us in the world who grew up in that lifestyle and the culture of being very comfortable moving around, being the first day of school. We're very comfortable in airports usually. Right. And so there's a whole set of characteristics that help define us. And so once I had that term, I could search for third culture kids. So I found Facebook groups. I found a book that we refer to as our third culture kid Bible that has done extensive psychological studies on third culture kids. I found Facebook groups, podcasts, books that were written by third culture kids, or TCKs as we refer to ourselves. And then I also started finding, when I searched properly, finding some groups that were for the schools that I went to in different places. So there's one for the school I attended in East Pakistan. There's one for the one in West Pakistan. And then I had a very few childhood friends that I even knew their last names. So I just did internet searches and I found a couple of them that had relatively unusual names that I could find, and I was able to talk to them on the phone. So all those little bits and pieces just helped me understand that I wasn't alone. I might have lived a lifestyle that was unusual compared to other people in any given social group, but there were many, many of us around, and some that even shared the exact same experiences I did because we were in the same place at the same time. So connecting with those people, even though I didn't actually know them at the time I lived there, just makes me feel like I have a sense of belonging that was missing for part of my life.
That's really incredible that you're able to do that, though, right? I think everybody needs to find a community, someone to bounce ideas off of, for support, anything else. That's incredible. Did they play a part in the writing process at all, though, or is that kind of just a little bit aside? Either way, great.
I was trying to keep it in the child point of view. So I have a little bit at the end where I mention these groups. Where they're playing more of a role is when I'm writing short stories about those experiences. They help support the book so I was just working on one for an anthology, for example. And that way I'm able to combine elements that I wrote about in the book as well as things that I learned basically afterwards. And as I thought about the structure of the book, and there's so much, and I can't include every single thing that happened to me, and every single thing wasn't that interesting. So when I tried to think about the kinds of scenes I wanted to link together in the book to tell my story, I needed them to have some sort of cohesive thought process. And so the part of my research took me into areas of psychology. So looking at childhood trauma, for example, I went to therapy for a brief period when I was in my mid-30s, and that was when childhood trauma was just starting to be researched. Well, now there's a whole lot of more information about childhood trauma. So I looked at the modern data on that. I looked at the epidemic of loneliness that gets talked about a lot. I learned about the science of belonging, and some of the books were, Oprah writing books with psychologists, and others were psychological studies. And so they they ranged from being more for the lay audience to being more technical books. But that helped me understand that one of the things that I was missing in my older life was this understanding of how important community is. So to back up a little bit, when I went to therapy in my 30s, I learned that with my lifestyle, I got really good at being adaptable, making friends very easily, keeping those friends for a period of time, maybe a year or two. But after that point, either I was moving or they were moving. So the skills that I didn't have a chance to ever develop because I never was in a place long enough was how to develop longer term relationships, how to make it through those tough times that start cropping up when you want to start trusting, but you have to share of yourself a little bit in order to have that back and forth. And so getting into some of that information, I understood more about what scenes I should include in my book to lead down that path to where I figure out that relationships are really important and long-term, and to develop skills for long-term relationships. And then later, even understanding the importance of community as a thing, that it's not just the closest relationships you have, it's that wider community that provides a safety net for us.
Definitely. And this applies to anybody, regardless of their walk of life, regardless of its, if you're, in your niche of community or anywhere else. I mean, writers, for example, also need a huge community. I'm sure many people do go into the writing process thinking it's a solitary act, but you need to form a community of people to sort of help you too. So I'm just kind of branching it into, what
Yes.
everybody else can learn from as well. So it's definitely something to learn about. So there's one thing I've been kind of curious. You've been mentioning and talking about how this whole book is about your childhood perspective. Have you ever considered writing about your more adult experiences? I mean, I was looking through those photos that you sent me of your more adult adventures. You've been all over the place, Japan and Italy and even like South America. So have you considered making a second book?
Well, I have written a book about some of my outdoor adventures. So I have a book on writing, on hiking the John Muir Trail. And I also do a lot of travel writing. So on my website, Inga's Adventures, I do have a lot of short stories and travel planning tips about other places. And so I have thought about maybe a future book might be maybe some more essays about some of the adventures we've had, because we do travel quite a bit. So that definitely has been rolling around in my head. My mom was a travel writer too. And so one of the ideas I've had is I've been to some places, but to try to go to all the places that she went, that she wrote about, and then maybe write about it from my perspective and from many years later. So I have a few ideas about future projects.
I like it. Well, always hold on to that. That's perfect. That being said, I guess I just have to also ask, I mean, where can we stay in touch then? If we have to, we want to know if these might ever come to the light, and also to learn more about you. I know where I can find more information. You have an amazing blog here with all this cool tips. Is this website of yours the best place, ignasadventures.com?
Yes, that's probably the best place. It's where I have announcements. And I'm also on Facebook. I have an author page on Facebook, and I'm on Instagram under Inga's Adventures and Blue Sky. So you can find me on social media as well as my website. And I do have a page on my website for the book, and I have some photos of my childhood photos of some of our experiences when we lived overseas.
Really cool stuff. I love it. Well, definitely everybody go ahead, check it out. We're going to put the links to this in the description box of the podcast today so everybody can click on over, learn tips about traveling, connect to the book, and just stay up to date. I mean, honestly, I was looking through some of your stuff, and funny enough, I'm actually going to South America myself in the summer. So I'm like 3 days in Lima. One of your recent blogs from last August. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be studying this here.
That's great. Yeah.
So.
I have a lot of stuff on there from a lot of different parts of the world.
Yeah, definitely. I could probably talk your ear off about all these different places, but to kind of transition it back into the writing, I'm wondering if you happen to have any last tips for the audience today regarding writing about your own experiences, translating it into such an incredible book as you have. What would you want our listeners to take home with them today?
I think being true to yourself and thinking about what you want to impart. I did want to write a hopeful book. And so one of the things you said resonated with me because when I was writing the book, I thought my experiences were so outsized, and yet I really am just like everybody else. So I think digging for those universal truths is a really important aspect of sharing your story, because in the end, we're all probably more similar than we think we are. And so figuring out a way to share your experiences, but also leave people with hope and a positive view of humanity is a nice thing. Doesn't always fit every book. There's so many genres out there.
Understood. Well, thank you for that. I think it's incredible to offer these new tips for everyone. So guys, you could take that to heart and apply it to your own writing now. Some perfect things for us to implement. Amazing things. I really appreciate you coming on today. You've shared so much, and your story has really moved me. I think it's amazing the amount of things you've done, and hopefully this has also inspired everybody listening today, not only to get out there and see the world a little bit, but if you also have an experience just like this, write it down, tell your story, learn about what's happened in your past too. It's incredible. So thank you again for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And again, everybody, if you're listening today, you can find Between Worlds wherever books are sold. Dive deeper about all these adventures also at ignasadventures.com, and we're going to put the links in the description box as we mentioned before. And just remember, fellow authors and dreamers, sometimes our greatest mission isn't to conquer new territories, but to understand the territory we've already traveled. So thank you for joining us today, and until next time, keep writing your story wherever in the world it takes you. We'll see you next time on the Authors on Mission podcast.
This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.